There was actually a pivotal moment for me. And it was my second year teaching. And, and I was teaching in a really diverse school as a white woman who didn't fully understand the diversity in which I was teaching and hadn't really been prepped for that in my teacher education program. And so, I approached education in a way where, I kind of expected my students to respond to education in the same way that I did, foolishly. And I had a 7th grade student who was a young African-American man. And he looked at me one day and told me, it is not cool for a Black boy to be good at French. And he was so frustrated with me for, really pushing him because he knew all the answers and I knew he could do it and he just didn't want to. And it was at that moment that I realized that I was failing my students. And I, and obviously the curriculum did not feel relevant to him. It did not feel meaningful. It did not feel important. And so I began my graduate work the next year and got into critical pedagogy for the first time. And it really started to understand what it means to teach world language in a way that is meaningful for all of our learners. And that the curriculum as it currently stands doesn't do that. And so then my work evolved and I began researching and investigating barriers that exist in schools that prevent our Black students from initially enrolling in language and that we have a low enrollment among Black students in particular in the K through 12 level in world language. And that persists today. And that in and of itself is a huge social justice issue in our field. And so I became really, really passionate about that topic because of the students that I had in my classroom. And I wanted world language to be an exciting place for them. And I wanted us to be able to figure out what are these barriers? What is preventing this? Why are students, minoritized students, not persisting in language like white students are? And so what are the issues at play? And what I discovered was a lot of racism in our schools. And so I kept investigating those issues for a number of years. And that, and another issue that arose is that, the coursework is really set up to be elitist in nature, the way that traditional world language coursework is set up. And it's really set up to appeal to white students and to situate our students within these European contexts traditionally. And that's not going to appeal to, and it's not going to allow our students to feel like the coursework is relevant to them and to their own lives. And so it's, that makes it really difficult for our students to want to persist in language. And it, our curriculum situates learners within a certain socioeconomic status. There are all of these issues at play. And that's the point where Pam Wesley and Beth Wassel and I decided that we really wanted to write a text for teachers that walks them through how they can integrate issues of social justice into their curriculum, approach things with a more critical lens in our language classes, and just approach world language teaching in general as social justice educators, and embody that in our world language classrooms. And so that's kind of what led me down that road. But I'm still really interested in examining those barriers. We don't have enough research about why our minoritized students, our Black students in particular, are not persisting in language study. We need more work around that. And there are people doing it, but we need more focus in that area.
So I really thank Cassie for bringing up some of the points she made, especially about the critical awareness and who these texts and curriculums serve, because I think that is precisely how it started with me. So it started with my identity. And because of my identity, I found that I have a critical awareness towards the spaces around me. And I can sometimes just walk into a room and know if it is or if it is not designed for me. And that goes the same for textbook. And definitely identity is not a skill set. However, it does help you see the world in a different way. And that pertains to social justice, because as a student, I always need to bring myself into the curriculum. And to do that strongly was advocating for myself. It was advocating for my Blackness. It was advocating for my queerness. And definitely in the Chinese language classroom, it wasn't discouraged, but I didn't really feel welcome. And that's even with having phenomenal teachers who I know were really energetic, which is typically traditional with Chinese language. An example of me trying to advocate for that and myself was in the critical language scholarship. My class, we did a form about relationships. And my teacher wanted us to kind of go on the route of the relationships of like father, son, and mother, daughter, and friend to friend, which is very valid. But I really want to talk about the relationship between those of different genders, races, and sexualities, and what power dynamics are there. So I came to class ready to go. I was trying to talk about implicit bias. I was trying to talk about double standards and talk about all these things that are really relevant to me. And it was just really difficult. It was definitely important, but it's definitely difficult to do. And so I think how that pertains to social justice is that my instincts have always been there, I think because of my identity. So I don't think there's one moment that really changed it, but one pivotal moment is, quite frankly, the Black Lives Matter protest. Because as it was happening, I realized that as a language student, this is something I would need to talk about. And definitely it's not something I can fix by myself all at once, but it's definitely important to start the conversation.
So I originally came from China. That's decades ago. I guess in many years, a millennium years ago. And so right now, as Abigail, you have introduced. So I am in charge of the Confucius Institute at Xavier, University of Louisiana. So I see quite some of my colleagues, my teachers, who have signed up for this session today. So for those of you who haven't necessarily heard about the Confucius Institute, it's a Chinese learning center. So it is named after Confucius, who was foremost an educator who lived about 2,500 years ago. So his ideas, his teaching philosophy and practices reshaped East Asian civilization, including Chinese, Japanese, and Korean civilization. So he pretty much laid the foundation for all the following like teaching ideas throughout East Asia. So we named this after him. I'm also in charge of our international center, international office. So our international office does 5 major things. So we admit international students, issue paperwork. We also host international scholars, like J1 visiting scholars. And we facilitate study abroad. For example, US students who want to study abroad in another country or region beyond the US. And we also enhance domestic exchanges. Right now we have domestic exchanges agreements with 5 other universities within the US, such as Harvard University, so in Washington, DC. So we send students to those schools and vice versa. And also the 5th task of my office is to advance or promote campus internalization. So to enhance students' global competency and multicultural abilities on campus. So those are what my office does for the international education program.
I mean, if we start with like the goal of world language instruction, right? The goal is to foster this deep understanding and appreciation of languages and cultures, but that is not possible if we focus just on language acquisition. And world language tends to veer more toward language acquisition. And you know, that's important. Nobody would argue with that. But I've really come to believe that the development of intercultural competence, the development of intercultural citizenship, that's much more important than the development of the language skills. And we can't really develop intercultural competence if we only examine culture from one perspective. And oftentimes it's that safe perspective. It's the 4 F's, right? Of culture, food, fun, the food fairs, festivals, facts. We tend to stick to those kinds of safe cultural topics. But we can't really understand the target cultures unless we also understand oppression and marginalization faced by groups in target cultures. We can't be inspired by people in target cultures if we don't understand the ways in which various groups advocate for themselves and engage in community action. Those kinds of things are really inspirational, and students can take what they're learning about that and do similar things in their own communities and learn how to advocate for themselves too and develop that agency. They really can't understand their own role in the world and their own actions without digging into those really important and sometimes difficult, sometimes complex topics. But there's a lot of hope too in a lot of communities in our target cultures, in the work that they're doing in their own communities to bolster each other and to advocate for what they need. And we have to be honest with ourselves as world language teachers. A lot of our students are probably never going to study abroad, right? And they're not going to be able to afford to do that. And there will be all sorts of barriers preventing them from doing that. And so, why do we make them memorize this vocabulary and this language that they will probably never use, right? So I think we have to think bigger than that. We have to think about the important things that we really want our students to leave our classroom with and take with them for the rest of their lives, knowing that they're not going to remember how to conjugate all of those verbs that we had them conjugate, or that list, that vocab list that we made them memorize. That's not what they're going to remember 10 years down the road. So if we want them to be really engaged citizens in the world and in their own communities, and even, like I talked about, that agency that we can help students to develop, that will leave a lasting impression on each of our individual students. And that's what I think world language classrooms are set up incredibly well to do, more so than a lot of other content areas. We have to switch our focus, and our focus can't just be on language acquisition. It's so much more what we're doing in the classroom.
I was trying to think about what I would need as a student in the classroom and what I really like to talk about. And I think, as was mentioned just now, it's really important to make the things that we're doing in our class relevant to our students and also to the outside world. For this specifically, what happened with this was at the end of the spring, when the Black Lives Matter protests were starting again, I wanted to help students be able to talk about that. So I decided to give them a Quizlet of about 18 words about, it was called Power, Policing, and Protest. And this was with the help of a friend from my college. And knowing that that was important, I shared it with my alumni group with the Critical Language Scholarship. And then they showed me to other Instagram pages of Chinese Americans trying to have the language to talk with their parents about this and try to unpack anti-Blackness in their own community. And also was shifted towards Letter for Black Lives, which was another online community of an open letter project of advocating for Black lives, but this was all translated into Chinese. And then seeing this happen, realizing that there was something here and that everyone was trying to activate their own communities. And so with that, that's how this all started with the Black Lives Matter curriculum they're trying to develop. Reached out to John, who is someone I interned with about 6 years ago in Shanghai. And we made a blog about why this is important, and then an Excel sheet of different levels and also different categories. Because I don't think every language student in the classroom in the US will immediately be able to talk about systemic racism or immediately be able to talk about implicit bias. Maybe we have to work there, or defund the police. I don't think that those are terms that are going to be easy to get to. So hopefully with this Excel sheet, it's really helping more people have it who need it, and that we can really start to just be imaginative in the classroom and be creative and find a way to really connect with our students, but also with what's happening in our world.
I do think that absolutely takes time. And so, you know, I mean, I think it can be overwhelming and it can be daunting for teachers sometimes to think about how they're going to do this work. But I really want to underscore that that it doesn't necessarily require creating all original content. Sometimes it does, right? And you know, and Amani has been clearly doing that work, and it takes time. And so some of that you do need to do. You do create some original things, but there are a lot of jumping off points in our existing curriculum that we can start with, and then we can get going on this work right away, as opposed to, you know, looking at our whole curriculum and thinking, oh boy, I have to throw out everything and I have to write all of these original units. How am I going to do that? And so, like, even looking at your vocabulary list, examine that through a really critical lens. And first of all, like, maybe ditch the 20 word, 30 word vocabulary list to begin with, but that's another story. You know, but when you look at that, it imparts certain values that we can really problematize with our students. And you know, and we can also co-construct some of that vocabulary with our students. And that's when I think it becomes really powerful. You know, when you maybe give them a jumping off point of 6 vocabulary words, but then you help them co-construct the rest of the list. What are words that are important to you that you want to be using through the course of this unit? And then we start to empower our students, and they become part of that process, and we can build that together, right? And when you look at some of those current materials, you can add to them, you can extend things so that you weave in those social justice topics. And, you know, when you start to look at your current curriculum, there are even some really interesting cultural blurbs that you can use, and you can teach students how to come at those with a really critical lens too. And that can be a really interesting jumping off point, you know, because a lot of those impart certain values. They'll be reading sometimes in textbooks about, you know, like, what is typical, or, you know, what is typical French, or what does a typical German family look like? Things like that. You'll find that in the curriculum. But those are really good. And I always tell teachers, keep those, because then you can teach students how to examine those in a really critical way, and you can bring in some other resources so that they are starting to look at things from other perspectives and really truly understand, you know, the topic in a broader way. But some of those materials that we already have can provide really good jumping off points, and we can find ways to integrate social justice into those topics. But a lot of it is teaching our students to adopt that critical lens and empowering them to investigate and to dig into these topics and to co-construct that with us, knowing that as teachers, we're going to be stepping into some of these topics, not being experts. And I think that's really key for world language teachers to understand, is that you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be the knower. You can adopt that anti-banking approach, and you can enter into the learning process with your students and tackle some topics that none of you are experts on, but you can investigate together and teach them how to really come at things with that critical lens.
I'm very lucky to be in a department that really does encourage me to push my boundaries. And I think that what can be difficult in trying to talk about social justice and equity and access is that, as you said, it can be a really critical issue that people are very sensitive to. However, I think one way to really help your students and actually put this stuff into the actual curriculum is to try to think of creative self-realization activities that can help students safely realize their implicit biases that can try to teach a larger lesson. And that would be culturally specific to what you're teaching. And a quick example I have is that in one of my classes, I did workshops to talk about gender and Chinese language and culture. And I really wanted to talk about the importance of pronouns because I wanted to let students know that what we're saying with our pronouns do actually mean something. And with Chinese, there's an entry point. So in Chinese, he, she is both pronounced ta, and then his, her is both pronounced tada. And they sound the same, but they're written differently. And so what I do with my class is every day in my class, we have a dictation, which is where I'll say a few words or a sentence, and they're going to write that sentence out. And given that they can't tell the pronoun in this case, what I did is I gave them sentences talking about this person likes to play sports. I want to invite this person to dance, or this person's really pretty. And they were really focused on the characters and like, oh, how do I write this? And then later I asked them in the same class, I was like, okay, now which pronouns did you use? And there were multiple, oh, I get it.
Mm.
And they were really talking about like, oh, I used it. And you can really help them realize their implicit biases in a safe way. And what they did, they were like, oh, I did this pronoun because I was told to always use this if I didn't know the gender. Some people said like, oh, I don't know if guys can be pretty, so I used female radical. Or maybe they say, in my example, I want to ask a girl out to dance, so I use the male radical. You can really see how your own personal perspectives and their own implicit biases, both of those can really influence how they're viewing this. And that was really successful because it's self-realization, but overall it's basically low stakes. And I think we can gradually talk about high stakes scenarios. I think another low stakes possibility is you can look at a picture and ask students what they see. That way they're not saying directly how they feel, but they can start to be introduced to new topics. Or use culturally relevant things such as idioms in Chinese. And really quickly, there's one called 袖手旁观, which is to fold your arms and to look at an observer. And figuratively, it means if you see someone in trouble, but you don't help them. And you can really talk about how it's important to speak about injustice. It just takes a lot of creativity, imagination, and just like courage, but definitely support from
his examples and suggestions are fantastic. And, you know, I mean, as far as, you know, like hope and next steps and where the field is headed, it's teachers like Amani that we need to be turning to and watching what they're doing. And that's where, you know, that's where I'm so inspired when I, since authoring Words and Actions back in 2014, and then we did another edition in 2018, there was a lot that changed in that 4 years, and we met so many teachers like Amani that were doing this absolutely incredible work, and we had no idea until we started engaging with them and kind of peeking inside their classrooms and taking a look at their lessons that they were creating. And so I think that there's a lot of really exciting work going on. And, you know, and I think the examples that Amani gave are really nice because it, I don't want to say that I don't want to say simple. Simple is not the right word, but it wasn't super time consuming for him to put together. Right. And so, you know, it's a nice entry point into these discussions in a way that you're still meeting your language goals. You're still meeting your content goals, but you're really starting then to dig into things. And I think he's exactly right where, you know, he starts with the students themselves. And that's exactly where we have to start. We have to start with the students' own identities and their own beliefs and have them, well, first, you know, affirm their identities in the classroom. That needs to be a constant process as we're building our classroom communities. I can't underscore enough how important that community building is in our classroom and those relationships with our students. That has to be first and foremost before you can do any of this other work. And so he's exactly right there in terms of starting with the students, but then helping them to really reflect on what they believe and you know, and dig into their own implicit bias. And that's where then they start to have these aha moments and we start to see some pretty amazing things happen in our classrooms. And so, you know, I think that there are a lot of different steps like that you can take. And I put in the chat room, you know, just building on what he said with the image too, there are so many visual literacy activities that serve as really great jumping off points. And again, you know, simple is not the right word, but they're not super time consuming to put together. And it serves as that launching board into the next activity and the next things in that unit. And you start off with that critical lens when you start with some of those activities. So I appreciated his examples. I thought that those were just perfect.
I think first, our guiding principle should be, we should treat our students with respect, with fairness. And so those should be our guiding principles. With that in mind, I think we can do a wonderful job in terms of promoting social justice, embedding social justice topics in our world language, Chinese language teaching. And I used to teach museum studies. One of the points that I often made was, for example, if you have a show, you have an exhibition, the most important is not necessarily how much information you give to this audience or visitors. Rather, it's the interest that your show has generated among your visitors. So they want, oh wow, this is a wonderful topic. I really want to, after the show, I really want to do more research. I want to improve myself. I want to participate in this discourse, this discussion, how we can make this a better society. I think that should be our goal. When you are in our Chinese or world language teaching, I think our goal is not only in terms of the content area, such as, let's say, you teach them the Chinese culture or history or French culture or another culture, but also this should be a transformative process. So you as the instructor, so you guide your students through a journey of discovery, of participation, of empathy. So how, let's say, for example, we talk about so this for example, in the Chinese word 子孙. So 子孙 is like a son and grandsons, right? So and then we can talk about family relationship, family, and in Chinese we often use this word 孝, is filial piety. So the respect between the son and the father, and then so the 孝 itself, the word itself is a son, the kid, or so one's descendant who is holding an old gentleman. So that shows kind of respect. But then in return, the father should also treat his son or his children fairly as well. So and then that can we can bring to us in the U.S. culture. Okay, what is our relationship here, and how does that relationship compare with the Chinese? Even when we talk about grandfather, grandmother, right? So we don't know is it my mother's father or my father's mother, or so. But then in China, early on, Amani mentioned ta, she, or he, right? So but in English as well. So we don't know those which side. But in Chinese, well, we have 祖母 or 爷爷, so 外公. So those words clearly delineate this kind of family relationships. I think then that this is kind of discovery, but also we want to encourage our students to learn and then to understand, to do some research. So maybe after class or in class, you have those group projects. You encourage them to be a researcher as well. So that I think what I would recommend. I don't necessarily answer your question, but then I think I'm very excited about this.
I think what's really pushing me forward is basically why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because I wanted to provide an environment that I didn't think I had as a student. And that's not for Chinese specifically, because I felt really connected to my Chinese teachers, but I just didn't see myself represented in the teaching staff, teaching faculty, in the curriculum, and maybe not even the classroom. And so I think what really helps me is that just knowing that your students are important, and any little moment you can grab onto as to who they are can really make or break their whole language career. Maybe you have one positive moment with the teacher, and then that you are the reason why they continue with this topic. Because I know I really, in my Chinese teacher now, because my Chinese teacher just believed in me and told me I should go abroad. And that really, just her words told me, and I really did that, and it really went somewhere. And I think that as I'm moving now, I'm trying to also think about how to let students create something that they stand by and put into the world so that they can really identify with that. And they can be like, oh, this is not only relevant to the classroom, this is relevant to my own life. That's a really culturally responsive thing. And then just trying to talk about the world now too, as it pertains to social justice. And now I'm trying to shift into being more explicitly anti-racist. And definitely a lot of work to do, but I feel like I know it's important and I have those instincts there. It's not about just reading more, reaching out more, and just having the courage to try and maybe fail. And then reflect on what went well and what didn't and continue on.
Really, truly, if we're going to be doing social justice education, action is a part of that. And so as we are modifying existing units or creating new units, we need to be thinking about how we are laying the groundwork for action for our students. And it's not feasible for teachers to lead their students in some kind of action-oriented project in every single unit that we teach. That's just not possible at the K through 12 level. It's not even possible at the post-secondary level. Sometimes it is. So, it may work with certain units, certain projects, but we can constantly be helping them to think about, okay, so in this situation, what is your action going to be? Or, depending on the unit. So like I would teach a unit on civil courage, for example. And, and so we would look at all of these different scenarios and they would have to justify why they would take action, why they would not, how can you take action? Even showing them there's some visuals of a woman in a hijab being harassed on public transportation. And there were, 4 or 5 steps in this visual image, and it comes in different languages. You can find it in different languages. There are 4 or 5 steps showing what kinds of specific steps you can take, bringing in those kinds of things. And one of them was simply go and sit down next to her. And, and so talking with students in the target language and showing them those kinds of things, and you can scaffold it for even novices. But, and showing them those kinds of things, they know, oh, if I saw somebody being harassed on public transportation and discriminated against because they're Muslim, for example, I could just stand up and just go sit down next to them just so that they're not alone, right? That's a pretty simple action. It takes courage. And so that's something that we discuss, but, finding those kinds of things and helping students to see what their next steps could be. And then always bringing it back to their own communities, and looking in their own communities, and comparing and contrasting, whatever the topic is. Well, what's taking place here? What are your experiences? What are the experiences of various people and various groups within your own school, within your own community? And looking closer to home and constantly engaging in that comparison. That's one of our standards anyway, so we should be doing that. But that can help students then to see where they can have an impact in their own school, in their own classroom, in their own communities, in their own families, all sorts of possibilities. But we have to constantly be thinking about how we're laying the groundwork for action in every single unit that we're teaching. Otherwise, we're not really, truly teaching for social justice.
So I put in the chat the Excel sheet that I'm working on with a large team with finding these words. And I think it's less about what the word is specifically, but the context of what that means in the target culture. For example, let's say we want to talk about privilege. Maybe we can, someone in this actual Zoom call right now, we talked about how do we talk about privilege, and privilege that maybe in terms of money, but maybe just in terms of skin tone. And what if that concept doesn't exist in another target, in the target culture? So you're gonna have some differences, and if it's a good question, then you probably won't find the correct, or the one-to-one perfect answer to it. Perfect translation. I think there are gonna be spaces where we're gonna ask it in different ways, and then that can help you lead to that. Let me add a little more quickly. Privilege, let's say we're talking about acknowledging privilege. What about recognizing privilege? What about leveraging your privilege? And I think that those are concepts that we're still trying to wrap our heads around in the US, or rather they continue to change. And so to have that in a different culture, you have to look at what's specific to that area. And I think let's look at finally activism. Mm-hmm. What's the connotation of activism in the US? What's the connotation of activism in China? What's the connotation of activism in Hong Kong? What about Taiwan? What about the East and West of America and like historically? And you're not going to get one answer. And I think that's exactly why we need to dive into those questions and find ways to try to let maybe your students or with them research what that looks like and try to have them articulate what that means from one culture to another. So I guess my advice is to really collaborate insofar as you have other people to collaborate with in your department. Because while I feel strongly about these issues in the US, I don't want to assume that I have that privilege to really speak for another country. And that's really that dynamic of being a non-native Chinese teacher. So if I want to talk about specific issues to Chinese people in China, I would ask a colleague, what do you think about this? Maybe how you feel about this, and how sensitive is that in the actual culture? Because I need to make sure that I'm being respectful and appropriate and not overstepping boundaries that I don't really have a right to overstep. But if we're on the same page and we can do this, then I would take their advice and try to add my own perspective to it as well. And then again, connect it back to US culture.
I think along with that, you have to be looking for authentic sources that are showcasing a variety of voices and perspectives, because even though, and I think you're exactly right, but sometimes even a colleague might have one perspective that isn't necessarily representative of how others in the target culture feel. And so, and I've run into that sometimes, like a teacher who maybe a native speaker of the language may feel really sensitive about a particular topic, but there are all of these authentic resources showcasing other voices and perspectives on the topic. And, so finding that balance, I think, is really important, but going directly to the source and bringing that in and then scaffolding that for your learners at different proficiency levels. But I think that those authentic resources, authentic images, that's going to be really key to being able to do it, because Amani is exactly right. You can't, as a non-native speaker in particular, I mean, you can't assume anything, and you don't want to represent things in a way that is not authentic and not accurate. But that's where, finding a variety of voices, a variety of perspectives, so that students can look at it through different lenses is going to be really important.
I think to jump in, this authentic sources, I think are very highly recommended. Next, for example, if you come upon a concept or an idea that may be interpreted differently in different cultures. So the first thing students may ask, they may criticize, they may disagree with a concept from another culture or country. But I think it's important to introduce students several sources or textures or texts that are written in the authentic setting by the, let's say, Chinese or French or Spanish authors, and then give them another perspective, other viewpoints, and then we can ask the students to compare. So this may be too sophisticated maybe for elementary students or even middle school. But then so you have, I'm sure you have other concepts that you're able to give them, so that they will. So you as the teacher is not necessarily give them per se as a correct answer. Rather, you develop them the ability to think, gradually develop this critical thinking capabilities. That's the way how I think the way we help them to have this independent thinking. Another example, for example, glass ceiling here in the US. So we often talk, we know that in Chinese, literally means body 顶, but actually the other word is 看得见摸不着. So the glass ceiling is often here in terms of one's career, for example. or social achievement. You can see it, but then you cannot really, obtain or so get the status that that it owes you. But in Chinese, this word may often means a little bit slightly different. So even the same wording, the concept can be slightly different. Yet you could, so the students can relate this idea with another culture, but then how it is constructed and interpreted historically and in the contemporary society. I think those are the ways you encourage students to think more in depth. That's what I would recommend. This kind of relation and then context building and then also authenticity. I think that those are the words I would recommend teachers. But I think at the same time, let me warn that I mean it is a language class. It's not a social studies or social justice class. I think I think language goes first, but then when during the process of instruction, of leading students discovering the beauty of the language, at the same time, you also help students to develop the concepts of social justice, and then also to be constructive in this process. I think that if I were the language teacher, that would be my goal.